One day I experienced something very unusual that I just have to share. I was in Arizona, the place known for its tall cacti and bright sun. I was looking at an old abandoned house that sat on a big piece of land. I've been thinking about buying a fixer-upper, something I could work on and eventually retire in, surrounded by beautiful scenery. This house was a few miles outside Prescott, in the middle of nowhere. When I arrived, the house immediately felt very unsettling. It was a big two-story building with boarded-up windows and peeling paint everywhere. It looked like it belonged in a scary movie. The real estate agent was supposed to meet me there, but she didn't show up. I called her and she apologized, saying something urgent had come up, but I could still look around. Even though I was alone, I decided to go ahead and explore. I had driven all that way, so why not? The front door was stuck, so I had to climb in through a broken window at the back of the house. Inside, it was just as eerie as the outside. There was dust and cobwebs everywhere, and that musty old house smell was strong, but the structure seemed solid. As I walked through the rooms, imagining how nice it could look once fixed up, I heard a strange noise upstairs. At first, I thought the real estate agent might have arrived, or maybe an animal had gotten inside, but the sound was odd. It was a scraping noise followed by a wet, dragging sound, like someone moving a heavy sack. Instead of leaving, I decided to find out what was making the noise. My curiosity got the best of me. I headed upstairs where the noise was coming from. At the end of the hallway, there was an old, closed door. I stood there for a moment, gathering my courage to open it. I usually don't get scared easily, but my heart was pounding. When I finally opened the door, I saw something I couldn't believe. The room was empty except for a figure crouched in the corner. It was very pale, with long, thin arms and legs that were much longer than a person's should be. Its eyes were shiny black, staring right at me. I was so frightened I couldn't move or make a sound. It made a hissing noise like air escaping from a tire and started moving towards me. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like it wasn't used to moving. As it got closer, I noticed its rough, pale skin and how thin it was, as if it hadn't eaten in a long time. Its fingers were long with sharp, dirty nails. The way it looked at me was both curious and hungry, its head tilted to the side, as if it was trying to figure me out. I felt a deep sense of dread, like I was seeing something I was never meant to see. The room was silent except for the hissing and my loud breathing. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. Just when I thought it was going to attack, there was a loud crash from downstairs. The creature whipped its head towards the door and I saw my chance. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I could hear the creature behind me making that same scraping, dragging sound. I ran down the stairs as fast as I could, praying I wouldn't trip. I could still hear it, but it sounded further away. Maybe it wasn't used to chasing things. I reached the ground floor and sprinted towards the broken window. I could see the sunlight outside, and it felt like a lifeline. I jumped through the window, not caring about the glass or how I landed. I hit the ground, rolled, and got up running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, glancing back at the house, half expecting to see the creature coming after me, but there was nothing. I got in, locked the doors, and drove away as fast as I could. I stopped at a small diner on the outskirts of Prescott, trying to calm down. I must have looked a mess because the waitress kept giving me concerned looks. I ordered a coffee, but my hands were shaking so much I could barely hold the cup. I kept replaying what had happened in my mind, trying to make sense of it. While sitting there, I overheard two old men at the next table talking about the area. Normally, I wouldn't pay attention, but after what happened, I was very interested. They mentioned an old abandoned house that was believed to be cursed. People had seen strange things around there. My heart nearly stopped. It had to be the same place. I finished my coffee, paid, and went over to their table. I asked them about the house, trying to sound casual. One of the men, who had a white beard, told me the house had a bad history. It was once owned by a recluse who was rarely seen and rumored to be involved in strange activities. After he died, the house was abandoned and strange sightings began. People reported seeing odd creatures and hearing strange noises. Most folks avoided the place. The other man, a bit younger, said his cousin once saw a pale, long-limbed figure near the house. It scared him so much he was never the same. Hearing this made me feel both scared and validated. I wasn't crazy. Others had seen it too, but it also meant what I saw was real, which was terrifying. I thanked them and left, knowing I should just forget about the house. But I couldn't, and I needed answers. I spent the next few days researching the house and its previous owner. I went through old newspaper archives and online forums. The recluse was very eccentric and had no family. After his death, the house decayed and became the subject of ghost stories. So now I'm torn between wanting to forget the whole thing and a deep need to find out the truth. What do you think? Should I go back there or not? A few years ago, I decided to go camping alone in West Virginia. The state is absolutely breathtaking with its lush forests and rolling hills. It's even called Wild and Beautiful on the state's license plates. I chose Blackwater Falls State Park for my adventure. My love for nature began with my grandpa, who taught me how to fish and camp. For me, there's nothing like a backpacking trip to feel connected to the world. Sometimes you just need a break from everything, so I picked a perfect autumn weekend for my trip. The trees were a spectacular display of red, orange, and yellow leaves. The cool air and the sunlight filtering through the branches made the forest feel magical. It was very quiet, as it usually is in the woods. On the first day, I spent time setting up my campsite and exploring the area. I didn't rush because setting up camp is part of the fun. I secured my tent, prepped my fishing gear, and gathered firewood. Since I was alone, I wanted to make sure everything was perfect. Before evening, I walked to the Blackwater River, an ideal spot for fishing. The river was peaceful, and I enjoyed the solitude as I fished. I felt a bit disappointed when the sun began to set, and I hadn't caught any fish. The approaching darkness meant it was time to pack up and return to my campsite. As night fell, the forest changed. The daytime sounds vanished, replaced by a deep, unsettling quiet. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel uneasy, like something is out there watching you. To distract myself, I heated some canned stew and ate by the fire. The fire felt comforting, not just for warmth, but as a shield against the night. Sitting by the fire, I couldn't help but feel a sense of fear creeping in. There was no specific reason for it, no strange noises or sudden cold breeze. It was just a feeling that something was not right, like an instinct telling me there was an imbalance in the environment. While I was trying to relax, I noticed a strange smell. It was sharp and out of place in the fresh forest air. It felt like an unknown presence had entered my camping area. As I prepared to sleep, the mystery of the smell weighed heavily on my mind. I had hoped for a peaceful night, but what followed was far from restful. My dreams were filled with a strange, large figure that seemed very real and threatening. I woke up with my heart racing, covered in sweat and goosebumps. The silence around me was so intense it felt eerie. I began to hear faint whispers around me. They sounded like the wind rustling through the trees, but scarier, and each whisper gave me goosebumps. I felt a deep sense of fear. I tried to convince myself it was just animals, maybe foxes or raccoons, but that didn't stop the rising panic. As I tried to calm myself, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A huge shadow nearly 9 feet tall stood in the darkness. It was not too deep in the woods, but close enough to be frightening. I blinked, trying to steady my hands on my flashlight. "It's just a tree," I told myself, but my imagination was running wild. Every small sound made me more frightened. The shadowy figure seemed to linger, never fully revealing itself, yet never completely disappearing. It felt like it was playing with my fears, enjoying my terror. In my mind, this tree-like figure turned into all sorts of scary possibilities, making me feel sick with fear. I couldn't sleep all night. I kept looking out of my tent, and the figure seemed to always be there. I huddled in the far corner of my tent, praying to every god I could think of, too scared to leave. As dawn finally arrived, whatever had been out there was gone, and surprisingly, I fell asleep. When I woke up hours later with the midday sun shining, I finally left the tent and looked around. There was no trace of the frightening silhouette. The woods were back to their usual welcoming self. The whispers were gone, and the sharp smell had been replaced by the earthy scent of damp leaves and pine trees. Looking back, it felt like a dream, as if it didn't really happen. But I knew deep down that I had experienced something real. I felt like a brave kid who had lived through a real-life scary story. I later realized that what I saw was a Wendigo, a creature my grandpa used to tell me stories about. I couldn't understand it then, but now I know what he meant. Sadly, he's no longer here to talk to, but I believe he's watching over me. Maybe that's why I made it through that night. Listening to your channel inspires me to share an experience from my past. I can't believe how much time has passed since this happened. Time really does fly. I'm much older now, but I remember it like it was yesterday. It was October, and the trees were dressed in their beautiful fall colors. I had traveled down to Missouri to visit my parents, and at the time, they weren't getting out much, so they were happy to have my help. I had been very busy with my business and hadn't spent much time with them over the past 5 years. We decided to pack up the RV and the boat and head to Truman Lake for some deer hunting. My mom was thrilled because it had been a while since we did something together. It felt really good to be home again. We set out in the middle of the week and drove 3 hours to the lake. One nice thing about that campsite was that the Army Corps of Engineers left the campsite amenities on during the fall deer hunting season, so we had it pretty easy and didn't have to rough it too much. The area we chose was deep in the woods. We were surprised to be the only campers in the whole park, but it was the middle of the week. We unloaded the boat and began setting up our camp. Back then, there was a lot of dead wood along the shoreline of the lake. We had to be careful of stumps under the water to avoid damaging the boat's propeller. Anyway, we were looking for signs of deer along the bank to set up a good spot for hunting. After about an hour, we found a nice place in the back of a deep cove, about 20 minutes from camp by boat. My dad and I used to go hunting there all the time, so it all came back to us quickly, and we worked well together. We set up 2 blinds, one on each side of the cove, to cover it from both directions. Then we went back to camp for dinner and some sleep. When the alarm went off, we got up and prepared for what we hoped would be a successful day. As we got ready, the first thing we noticed was the complete silence in the woods around us. Not even the wind was blowing. It felt strange, but we thought it was just because it was early. We got on the boat, started the engine, and headed for the blinds. We arrived just as the sky was starting to lighten and tied the boat about 100 yards from the blinds. We proceeded on foot, but the whole time there were still no sounds except for our footsteps. Then both my dad and I were suddenly filled with a sense of dread. We looked at each other, unsure of what to think. There was nothing unusual to see, just the quiet. So we tried to ignore it. When I reached the blind I had set up, I realized we were not alone in the woods. My blind was all messed up, and there were tracks all over the place. I couldn't tell what kind of tracks they were because they were in loose gravel along the shore, but I knew they hadn't been there the day before. Over by my dad's blind, it was the same story. The materials were scattered around like a warning from someone who didn't want us there. My dad was very upset, but we had no idea what we might be dealing with, so we decided to leave. As we got closer to the boat, we noticed something was wrong. It was sitting lower in the water than usual. When we reached it, we found that someone or something had punched a hole at the waterline with a big rock that was still lodged in the hull. This boat was one of the toughest aluminum hull boats you could buy. It was incredibly sturdy, and my dad had taken it on some rough trips, and it had always held up. My dad crawled into the boat and turned on the bilge pump, which helped. The whole time, we felt like we were being watched. My dad pumped enough water out so we could pull the boat further on shore and patch the hole with a life jacket and duct tape. Just as he finished the repair, we heard a rustling in the trees behind us. We turned around and saw a towering figure coming out of the undergrowth. At first, I thought it was a bear, but it was enormous, about 8 feet tall, and it was covered with shaggy brown fur, but its body was very muscular. The head looked more like an ape or maybe a caveman, with a pronounced brow. It was like a picture of a Neanderthal come to life. As it emerged from the trees, we could smell a strong, musty odor. We were frozen in place, staring at it, but then it let out a low, guttural growl. That was enough to make my dad and me scramble to get on the boat. We cast off, and it let out another roar, louder and more menacing. We got back to camp and packed up quickly. We told my mom that I had rammed the boat into an underwater stump, but she knew we were lying and got the truth out of us. We left there as fast as we could and have never been back since. From everything I've read, it sure sounds like that was a Bigfoot, but I had been to that lake countless times before and had never seen anything like it. One night I was sitting alone in the living room watching TV around midnight. My family had already gone to bed. I was just about to go to sleep myself when I noticed something move outside the window. I assumed it was an animal, as there were always animals around the farm, but I decided to take a closer look. When I peered through the window, I saw a black, shadowy figure standing in the middle of the cornfield. It scared me a lot, so I grabbed my uncle's shotgun from above the fireplace and ran outside, but when I got to the field, there was no one there. I couldn't sleep that night and spent hours staring out the window, but I didn't see anything else. The next morning at breakfast, I couldn't stop thinking about the shadowy figure. I hadn't slept at all, but I tried to act normal. As we ate, I finally gathered the courage to ask my uncle if he knew anyone who might be wandering around the cornfields at night. He gave me a strange look and asked why I wanted to know. I hesitated, but then told him about the figure I had seen the night before. His face turned pale, and my aunt quickly left the room. My uncle told me that the nearest house was 10 miles away, and no one ever came around. When he asked what exactly I had seen, I described the shadowy figure standing in the cornfield. My uncle got very angry, shouted that it was just my imagination, and then stormed out, got into his truck, and drove off. My aunt tried to cheer me up with a piece of her homemade pumpkin pie, but I felt too uneasy to enjoy it. Later that day, I went back to the cornfield to look for any clues. I walked slowly, scanning the ground for footprints or any signs that someone had been there. I even got down on my hands and knees, searching carefully, but there was nothing. The ground was smooth and undisturbed, with only my footprints and a few animal tracks visible. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I felt like I was being watched, and it made me feel very uneasy. I told my aunt that I wanted to leave early, but she begged me to stay and apologized for my uncle's behavior. She tried to explain his outburst, but I wasn't convinced. That night, my uncle returned and acted as if nothing had happened. Over the next few days, I continued to see the shadowy figure standing in the same spot in the cornfield, night after night. It was clear to me now that it wasn't a human being, but something more mysterious, perhaps a spirit. Whatever it was, I knew it was dangerous. Every time I saw it, I would run outside to chase it, but it always disappeared before I could get close. It seemed to know when I was coming and would vanish just in time. The fear and frustration built up inside me until I felt like I was going to break down. The worst part was that I had no one to talk to about it. My uncle didn't want to discuss it. My aunt pretended everything was fine, and whenever I called my parents, my aunt and uncle would make sure I didn't say anything about it. It was a nightmare. One night I heard something right outside the window of the room I was sleeping in. When I looked out, I saw the figure standing close to the window, looking in at me. I could see through it just a little, but it was clear enough that I knew it had a head and hands pressed against the glass. I was terrified. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then the figure vanished, and I was finally able to scream. My aunt and uncle ran into the room, asking what was wrong. Shaking and crying, I told them what I had seen. My aunt and uncle exchanged a long look, and then my uncle told me to come into the living room. He poured us both some juice, and then he began to tell me about the shadow people. He said they had been a problem for years. I was shocked. My uncle explained that at first, my aunt was the only one who saw them, and everyone thought she was losing her mind. She spent some time in a hospital and seemed to be getting better, but when she came home, she saw them again, and my uncle didn't believe her. Then one night, my uncle woke up to a shadow person choking him. He had a heart attack and almost died. He never told anyone because he thought he was going crazy. After a lot of convincing from the family, my aunt and uncle finally decided to sell the farmhouse and move closer to where my parents live. To this day, my uncle refuses to talk about the shadow people, but I'm here to tell you that they are real and they are dangerous. This story is very close to my heart and it talks about some very sad things, so I want to give you a warning before I continue. Many teenagers experience feelings of sadness and worthlessness. I went through this and so did my friends. It's a tough time when you start to question your purpose and who you are. I don't really know why I felt this way, but these feelings kept coming back, stronger each time. One of the hardest things was losing a friend who took their own life. I think that had a big impact on me. My grandma often says that sadness is like a sickness. When someone is sad, it can spread to others, making them feel sad too. I wish I had understood this better at the time. It all started with a person in our town. I knew them, but we weren't close friends. I saw them at school now and then. One day they didn't look well. They seemed distant and unhappy. Soon after, we heard the terrible news that they had taken their own life. Everyone was heartbroken. I couldn't stop wondering what had made them so unhappy. The more I thought about it, the more it affected me too. Now you might be wondering what all this has to do with anything strange or unusual. It has everything to do with the unusual because of what I experienced. Not long after the funeral, a friend and I were talking. My friend said they were feeling strange and unlike themselves. I told them I felt the same and shared my grandma's advice to try not to let our minds wander too far into sadness. But then my friend told me something really frightening. They had seen a tall, thin figure that spoke terrible things to them. This figure would tell them the most awful things, and my friend didn't know what to do. I promised my friend that I would help them through it. But then, to my horror, my friend took their own life too. In my culture, we talk about spirits and beings that aren't human. My grandma says these spirits don't speak to us the way humans do because they don't understand what it's like to be human. It's confusing, but I'm getting to my point. One evening I was walking home from school after staying late for detention. It was late fall, so it was already getting dark, even though it was only 4:30. I took a path behind the school through a wooded area. I liked the path because it was quiet and peaceful. I had my headphones in and was listening to music. Suddenly my music started skipping and then stopped working altogether. Annoyed, I tried to fix it but couldn't. Feeling down, I put my phone away and kept walking. The wind picked up, making it very cold. Leaves were falling from the trees and the branches were creaking. I thought to myself how strong the wind was. Then I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. Ahead of me, standing among the trees, was a figure. It was very tall and thin, almost like a shadow with glowing eyes. I was terrified. I could hear it whispering something, though I couldn't make out the words. But then it started saying names, my name, my friend's name, and the names of others who had recently died. I realized this must be the figure my friend had seen. I broke down and cried, curling up on the path. Then I felt a touch on my shoulder. I jumped and turned around. It was a person walking their dog, asking if I was okay. I looked back towards the trees and the figure was gone. I don't know if the kindness of the dog walker or my refusal to listen to the figure's words kept it away, but I never saw it again. Even though I still mourned my friend and others we had lost, I no longer felt that deep, heavy sadness. I learned not to take anything for granted and that we should always appreciate the people in our lives.